They found the house on a gray ridge above the upper Harz, where spruce needles matted the earth as thick as felt, and the wind carried the smell of wet iron from old nails. Elena Kovacs, 34, a field archivist with a taste for ruined farmsteads, shouldered open the warped gate with the hand that wore her narrow braided bracelet, a strip of dark leather fastened by a small brass stud, while her enamel mug of tea cooled on a stone just beyond the stile. She kept a battered paperback in the outer pocket of her rucksack, its spine long ago mended with tape, and a square black and white photograph tucked like a charm into the book's last pages. Her grandmother on a hillside above Balaton, smiling as if the light itself were a private joke. The photograph was not for luck so much as for balance, the way a climber carries a talisman pebble. You could say Elena preferred rooms where a mug, a book, and a photograph could be set down and persuade a place to behave like a place. From the map they had printed in Göttingen, a 1:25,000 survey sheet from 1924 gnawed at the corners by decades. There should have been a farm lane, but the lane had become a thread of moss and a row of stones. The house rose out of the slope like a stranded barge, granite blocks, a narrow eave, high windows with stone lintels darkened by weather. Someone had screwed a post-war walled Schutzgebiet sign to an elder tree, and the letters had dissolved into a pale flock. Beside Elena, Jonas Remke, 38, a historian who wore his wool cap like a promise to his mother, read off coordinates. Behind, Marie Blum, 31, a geodesist with a notebook of exact lines, whistled quietly so the silence would not gather too quickly. The front door yielded only when Elena leaned her shoulder under the iron latch and felt the wood give in a tacky way, like the first jar on a high shelf after winter. Cold air moved out, the kind of cold that knows stone. Her torch picked out a table first, an honest, square, oak thing with a fat drawer and a burn mark at one corner, then the table's legs, and then a detail that closed her throat. Each leg was fixed to the floorboards with heavy forged nails, their heads burnished by a hand worried about neatness even at the end of a blow. She slid the light left. The chairs were nailed. The bench by the stove was nailed, with angle irons cut from a door hinge and clenched into the boards. The tall cupboard had been pulled forward and pinned through the skirting. Even the sewing machine table sat on a small wooden plinth, and the plinth was nailed. In the window light, a chipped white mug stood on a coaster. Only when she stooped did Elena understand the coaster was itself a thin round of wood fastened to the floor with two black tacks. Her own enamel mug, cooling on the stone outside, suddenly felt like an indulgence, a tourist. They moved as people do in rooms where furniture is not entirely furniture. Elena's bracelet clicked against the torch. The stove in the center, one of those iron bellies with a lid like a coin, was belted to the flagstones by a strap of hammered steel. A child's bed in the second room had been set on a shallow pallet, the pallet secured by four nails whose heads had been countersunk and filled with resin. In the third room, the smallest, with a window that looked into first shadows, a calendar hung above a narrow desk. 1927. All the small leaves had been cleanly torn away until only one remained, 17 October. In the white rectangle of that day, written by a patient hand in a schoolmaster's ink, was a single word, hoot. Elena took a breath and brought her torch closer because she had learned not to trust her first reading of a detail that wants to be myth. The loop of the H had a little flourish at its cap, a particularity you inherit from copybooks. The tail of the Y curved back with restraint. Nothing else on the desk, no blotter, no sand shaker, no pen. She looked down at her phone because habit sent her there, and the habit put a date on the dark, October 17th. They went back into the room with the stove and sat, because one sits when a room asks for it. Jonas wrote coordinates on his pad and underlined them twice. Marie paced from nail to nail, counting under her breath, as if her comfort could be bought in fives. Elena set down the torch, took her own mug from the stone step, and set it, without thinking, on the nailed coaster beside the window. The lip of the mug found the old cup ring like a returning animal. In their first pass, they recorded what they could trust. The house was late 19th century, granite laid by a man who liked his courses straight. Roof tiles, fired clay, not slate, some slipped, some cracked. The big room, the kitchen, held a piano shored by steel plates. Yes, even the piano. And in its open fallboard lay a roll of music where small hands had penciled fingerings above notes like little sums. The titles were church pieces and a march learned at funerals. On the wall above, a lithograph of the Sermon on the Mount had bled its colors into a general brown. There was a cupboard for jars and a row of hooks for spoons and ladles. The rack itself affixed with extra nails as if the person doing the affixing had learned from a certain kind of accident. They spent the rest of the afternoon tracing the house with their lights and with their fingers. The writing on the back of a cabinet shelf had been covered in smoke, but a thumbnail and a little spit made two letters appear, F.B. The ledger they found in the pantry, under a collapsed box of marbles, wore a dark green cloth cover and the kind of elastic that hardens into a tendon. Inside, a list: soap, salt, twine, Angora wool for mittens, and in the back a note in the same hand as the calendar. Kitchen clock 7 minutes fast. Good. On the undyed linen of the bed, a tiny tag hand-stitched with GB. On a high shelf, a paperback of Jules Verne in German, a cheap 1906 edition whose pages had been cut with a knife that left little feathers of paper at the foredge. Dried leaves were marks in its chapters: Maple, Rowan. In the margin beside a passage about comets, someone had drawn a single precise star. That night in their rented room in a hunter's shack a kilometer down, Elena poured tea, turned her bracelet once on her wrist, and began the kind of list without which her work felt unmoored. Table, nailed. Chairs, nailed. Bench, nailed. Piano, plated and nailed. Child's bed, pallet and nailed. Cupboard, pinned. Sewing machine, plinth nailed. Mug coaster, nailed. Stove, belted. Hooks, doubled. Calendar, 1927. October 17th, Hoot. Ledger, G.B. Handwriting consistent. Initials, F.B. She added a small paragraph about the nails, hand-forged, square-shanked. Their heads hammered slightly concave to avoid sharpness. Many driven at a bias so the wood would clamp, some oiled. She put the paper back on the table and left the photograph inside it like a lid. The clerks at the Kreisarchiv in Goslar, decently intrigued by clean notes and the promise of a story that would embarrass no one, brought out the cadastral sheets and the village lists. On a roll from 1923, a rectangle appeared like a minor confession: Bauerhof, without a field name. The family: Karl Bauer, born 1888. Wife: Greta, 1892. Children: Friedrich, 1915. Anna, 1918. Lotte, 1922. In a card scrawled in 1927, a line had been drawn through the place with a neat ink: Abjurist, departed, without another line showing where. There were no records of a sale. No taxes paid, no taxes owed. The register swallowed any trace that would have made this a tidy case of migration. An old woman named Ottilie, who had given up the habit of pretending not to enjoy telling stories, said she remembered Karl's hands. He could drive a nail without lifting his shoulder, she said. When the wind tore our shutters in 1919, he put them back so they lasted 3 more storms. She looked at Elena's bracelet and smiled as if it were a border guard stamp. He did not like open doors, she added, and then sat with the satisfaction of a sentence that makes the room consent. They photographed, measured, filed, and returned. Beneath 2 swollen boards in the kitchen, they found a newspaper from August 1927 with a note about a new hydroelectric plant on the Oker and a notice for a fair in Bad Harzburg. In the margin, written in a child's hand that labored to make each letter stand as tall as a soldier, was a name, Lotte, and written several times in different pencils, the word Hoot. In the pantry, behind the ladder, a small door opened into the gap beside the chimney, a space cool and dry as a drawer. On a nail, a pair of tiny leather shoes, the soles neatly stitched. On the floor, a box of dried plum pits, compote, but the pits had been counted and then pushed into a corner to make room for something else. On the shelf, a tin with tint printed in blue. When Elena angled it to the window, she saw the ink had not become stone. It moved with the deliberateness of honey in winter. The people who had lived here stepped forward through the clutter of their obligations. Karl could be seen in the hammer with the scarred face, in the precise angle irons under the bench, in the habit of driving a square nail at a bias to clamp a plank to its neighbor. His thin leather wristband. Yes, they would find it later, threaded through a chair back, its brass button nicked in a crescent. Appeared in a faded photograph too. A man's forearm cropped at the elbow, a child with a mug at a table, and around the wrist a braid like the one Elena wore, only older, more countryside than city. Greta could be read in the order of jars, and in the pressed leaves in Verne, and in the way the bed linen had been patched at the shoulder with machine stitch and then hand-whipped to stop it from fraying. Friedrich left his initial in a pencil box and 2 caricatures in a school notebook: a pastor, a cow, and a high shelf where something had once been hidden from a mother's hands. Anna appeared in the back of the little photograph someone had labeled Annie, 8 jar, and in a tiny A scratched with a knife into the window ledge. Lotte was the voice that had learned to write one word and liked the trick of it, writing it again and again until it became a spell. The nails were not the work of a panic. They were patient. Where a novice would have split the wood, someone had pre-drilled with an awl. Where a nail head would have bitten a plank, someone set a washer. Even the screw holes on the underside of the sewing table had been chamfered so the screw would take without chewing. It was, Jonas said quietly, the kind of work a man does when he has decided to make ordinary life obey, but has not yet crossed the line into hating the things he owns. They asked around for reasons because reasons give rooms back to people. The first, offered with the confidence of distance: storms. The house sat on a ridge where the winter winds bullied, and the furniture had been secured against the shutter that makes chairs walk across floors. The second, thieves. But the nails showed a man who knew that a thief simply lifts a board if he needs to. Nails do not stop theft, they stop drift. The third, tax and seizure. Inspectors in the 1920s had come with lists and numbers and a way of looking at a room that made tables into columns. He told the man, Audley said, that everything has its own right to be here. The man told him things have a right where they are recorded. Carl showed him the floor. She laughed and then looked ashamed of laughing. The police records from the time were a wash of dull weather. No missing family of Bowers. No court case. In a folder of 1,946 interviews with returnees, a Forrester said he had found a locked door and a clean kitchen. As if someone rose early to leave, he wrote. The furniture would not cooperate. Elena did not believe in calendars that know what year it is. She believed that paper drinks what is poured onto it and keeps the stain. Still, the word on the little square of October seemed darker each day, as if the ink took water out of the air. Marie measured the slope of the H one morning with a transparent grid and came back the next with the overlay and found the line heavier by a hair, a trick of light, perhaps, or of eyes that have chosen their story. Jonas took the ledger to the light and found on the last page a stamp made by the brass of the bracelet, as if someone had been bored or tinder, pressing the button into a pad of ink and then onto paper. He slid his thumbnail across the impression and found the paper had raised itself to meet the brass. In the cellar, they found the workbench bolted to brick and a square worn in the stone the size of a man's 2 feet standing. The box of nails was a model of intent. Long ones, short ones, square and round, sorted. In the corner lay 3 keys, graduating like suns in a photograph, small, middle, tall. Only one fit the little door behind the pantry shelf. It squeaked, not with rust, but with a sort of affection. Anyone who has spent time with ledger pages knows that a hand can be a biography. The calendar's script and the ledger's script and the line on the back of a photograph in the pantry shared a small grace at the cross, and the habit of curling a Y back into itself as if embarrassed by tales. The same hand had written hoot on the calendar and kitchen clock 7 minutes fast and the neat receipts of soap and salt and string. It had also written a sentence on a scrap of paper they found at the bottom of the desk, almost erased by damp. Call them by their names, and they will come to stand where they belong. It was not signed. The paper bore the ring of a cup. Myths came the way they always do when a story won't end with one verb. A practical one. He had secured the house for winter, everything fixed for a long absence under snow. A bureaucratic one. He had pinned down the furniture so it could not be weighed, counted, seized, stubborn peasant algebra against forms. A pastoral one. A family with a sick child. To keep her safe, they nailed her world to the floor. A religious one. Your grandmother tells you in a voice you recognize from rain. A soul cannot leave a room if the chairs can walk. A cruel one. A man went mad and forced the house to keep him. The best of them had the humility to stay theories and not choose a verdict. They brought in the district heritage officer, who wore his scarf like a job title and did not like to be surprised. He grumbled at the nails. This is vandalism, but domestic, and then looked at the calendar and stopped talking. He said he would recommend an immediate survey and a temporary protection order. Do not remove anything, he said, as if they hadn't learned that lesson in their bones already. Elena nodded, folded the ledger back into its cloth, and slid the photograph of Annie, 8 jar, back into its box. Her bracelet tapped the box's edge. That night the hunter's shack let the wind through its seams. Elena woke twice thinking she had heard a chair scuff. In the morning she set her own mug on the window ledge and noticed the way the ring it left made a small covenant with the wood. She thought of the coaster fixed to the floor in the house and felt foolish for a moment, and then not foolish at all. They found a camera in a drawer, a Voigtlander folding thing with bellows that, when extended, made a short, brave tunnel, and in its holder a film that had blackened into a strip of secrets. With advice from a museum in Magdeburg, they slipped the holder into a paper sleeve and sent it for gentle work. 5 frames came back like feathers from a dead bird. The table, the lamp above it, the bed and the brown lithograph, the child's bed with its carved horse, the wall with the calendar without a word in its small square. Someone had put the ink on later. Or someone had made a second calendar of the same year and left a sentence waiting to be true. Winter came up the slope and the house took it as if it had been cast for the role. Snow lined the window sills like a ledger's rule. The calendar's paper went the color of tea. The ink held. The word was not a trick, it was a habit. Elena started leaving her watch in her pocket before she went in because the idea of carrying a second precise today into that narrow room felt like stepping on a bread heel. They traced the family in other rooms. In the church records, 3 christenings, no funerals. In a municipal register, a new line in late 1927 had been started and then left blank. In the local paper, a line in a winter column, and signed, "Gratitude to the unknown carpenter who mended the pews so they did not wobble in the cold." Adelie said she remembered Greta's cake at a school fair the year before, the one with prunes, and the way the woman folded a scarf into the flower bin to keep mice away. She remembered a photograph going round with the newspaper, teacher's handwriting on the back. She did not remember the date. The most decent explanation they heard came not from a historian, but from a retired tax clerk with a mathematician's tidy mind. In those years, he said, the Republic counted everything. Counting is not evil, but it makes people resist being columns. A man might nail a chair to the floor not because he thinks someone will steal it, but because he wants to say, this is not abstract. You asked for numbers. I give you weight. He looked at Elena's mug and said, bring the coaster, too, when you take your photographs. Otherwise you misrepresent the world. The day they found the envelope, Elena had to sit down on the nailed bench to read it. The desk drawer had been stuck for a week and a half, and then, as sometimes happens with things that resist until dignity requires they stand aside, it slid. A small paper, folded twice, addressed in ink the color of dried plum, for die knock you an S common. For those who come after us. The first lines were gone into the brown of the paper. The last two were clear. Do not take them from where they are. Otherwise each day will be a stranger. The place where a signature would have been bore only a faint ring. The mark a brass button leaves when it has been set on paper a moment too long. They did not remove anything. They took measurements, photographs, rubbings, lists. They drank their tea outside or on the nailed coaster because defiance in small matters is vanity. Elena, who had learned in museums that the most honest photographs include the way a thing is held, made a picture where the bench's iron angle glanced the light and showed a nick where a hammer had kissed too hard. On an early afternoon in March, when thaw water made a sound under the steps like whispering, the word on the calendar looked newly wet. Jonas, who hated melodrama, fetched a loupe and tilted the paper to the window. The ink was not wet. The paper had become a little translucent where it had been forced to carry the weight of a sentence for a long time. Marie made a note on her grid. H flourish slightly heavier, 0.3 degrees more open. This is nonsense, she said, and then wrote the numbers anyway. News reached a small circle of men who like to save things. A letter arrived from a cousin of a man who had been a clerk in 1927. A clipping from the Goslarsh sighting, vague. A family in the high forest obliged to move by reassessment. The place left sealed. No names. Another letter came from a woman in Closthal who said she had sung with a girl named Anna in 1930 and did not know whether it was this Anna and did not want to be wrong. A man said there had been a loan and the carpenter had kept his pledge too carefully. None of it made the nails less real. If you stood in the little room and waited until your breathing did not startle the dust, you could imagine the day the sentence was written. A man who knew his letters dipped the nib and made a bold H, and then put down the pen and looked up as if to hear whether the word would do the work. A woman stood in the door and watched his shoulder and did not say the thing she wanted to say because she liked to save her words for when they would change something. A child reached up to touch the small calendar leaf and was told not to with a gentleness that was also a command. Someone set a mug on the desk and made the ring. When the ink turned dry, they left the room and closed the door quietly because doors deserve to be spared. Sometime in the second spring, Elena found a second calendar of the same year in a bundle of string in the pantry, every leaf still bound at the top. The paper was whiter, the font the same. No writing in any day. She set it beside the nailed one and felt ridiculous for feeling relief at the idea that there had been two and not one page with an impossible habit. They stayed with the house a long time. The forest learned their names and stopped performing for them. Elena's bracelet wore a tiny crescent on her wrist from the brass, where her skin liked to settle. The book in her rucksack changed. Sebald's Emigrants had replaced Verne, then back again, but the habit of a book did not. The photograph of her grandmother kept its square of light like an obedient coin. She found herself taking off her jacket and folding it the way Greta had folded the scarf into the flower, a habit learned from a room rather than a person. There were formalities. The district put up a notice and then a better one written by someone who could write without being officious. The house was given a protection number, and then a small fund was made by a woman who remembered having been a child on a bench. Students came and learned to make rubbings of nail heads. A local man who called himself a guide and liked to lecture was told by the heritage officer, in a rare flare of temper, that if he told the story of haunting one more time, the officer would nail his bicycle to the path. In the end, as endings go, the house accepted its role as a room you could visit without violating it. The furniture remained where it belonged, not because of law, but because of something stronger than law that people sometimes obey. The calendar stayed. On some October 17th, people happened to be there, and the word did what words do, which is exist. On one such day, Elena stood in the doorway with her mug and tried not to watch the ink, tried not to measure anything. She looked instead at the narrow brass ring on her wrist and the way it threw a tiny square of light onto the desk. She slid the photograph of her grandmother from the paperback and set it for a moment on the desk beside the ledger and the mug ring. The faces in the room regarded one another and were not strangers. When a writer for a magazine came and asked for a clean ending, Jonas told him the truth, that there was none. The family probably left under pressure of money. They might have gone west and taken another name or gone nowhere and been swallowed, bureaucratically, in a century that knows how. The nails were the record of a man's temperament and a temporary agreement with physics. The calendar was a devotion to a daily vow. The sentence on the folded paper said what a schoolteacher would have said in a sermon if anyone had asked him to give one. Do not take things from where they belong. Otherwise, each day will not know you. They wrote their report carefully, letting the sentences wear their own clothes. They listed the house in the registry under its ridge and the coordinates, and in the description Elena smuggled a kind of prayer by way of accuracy. All movable furnishings found secured to the floor by forged iron nails, straps, and plinths. Evidence indicates intentional, patient work, not haste. A calendar leaf of October 17, 1927 bears the word hoot in iron gall ink. A ledger in the same hand reads, kitchen clock 7 minutes fast. Good. A note addressed for die knock UNS common states. Do not take them from where they are. Otherwise each day will be a stranger. She signed her name and the date and put her bracelet's shadow across the page as she wrote because the sun had found her hand. Years later, schoolchildren would be brought up on a day when the mud was tolerable, and a teacher who had learned to love rooms would say to them, look closely at how the nails are set. Look at the coaster. Look at the small square of paper on the wall. One child would raise a hand and ask the only question that matters. The teacher would answer as well as a person can. They wrote today, she would say, and then they did not forget it. If you stand there, if you are spared, at the hour when light learns a room, you will notice the way the mug rings glow and then dull, the way wood swells and rests, the way iron remembers blows long after the hand that struck them has forgotten. You will feel suddenly large with ordinary objects. You will understand, though you may not feel brave enough to say, that a nailed chair is a kind of vow and a calendar with one day is not a trick but a discipline. You will be tempted to declare a moral. Resist. Better to set your own cup down and see where it wants to leave its circle. Better to touch the desk with your knuckles and call the names you have the right to call. Better to take your book out of your pocket and tuck a photograph into it, so the page will not be lonely. On the way down, Elena would sometimes slip the bracelet from her wrist and polish the brass button on her sleeve, and the metal would carry the warmth of her tea for a minute longer than it should. She would think of Greta's pressed leaves, of the star in Vern's margin, of a child's careful letters making the same word until it acquired a gravity. She would think of a man who did not like open doors in a winter that needed furniture held in place. She would think, not for the first time, that the kindest mystery the house had kept was not the date on the calendar, but the dignity of a family whose exit left no vandal's shadow on the wall. And if, on another October 17th, the ink looks a fraction darker, if the loops of the H seem to have weight again, she will not bring out the grit. She will set her mug on the nailed coaster and watch the ring deepen on the wood and say, because the room expects someone to say it, and someone always should, today.